Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 69, Incroyable. The increasing political fragmentation at the Burgundian court was centered on two overlapping axes. The England-France debate that we covered last time on one hand, and the House of Croy, their allies, and their enemies on the other. Although I've been mentioning the Croy for a while, they haven't really gotten the focus that they probably deserve, so here we go. At the beginning of the 14th century, the House of Croy was a Banneret family in Picardy, squarely in the middle of the aristocratic hierarchy. They were not petty lords, although they were not especially powerful ones either. But through some advantageous marriages, the family was able to build up their wealth and their land holdings. Jean de Croy, who we first met in episode 20-something, entered Burgundian service towards the end of the 1300s, and by the turn of the century he had become a chamberlain of Philippe the Bold. Under John the Fearless, Jean de Croy's fortunes rose even further. He would continue to serve as a chamberlain under the second Valois Duke, and before long we're seeing indications that he had made his way into John's inner circle. Croy's rise was also not hurt by the fact that his daughter Agnes became one of the Duke's mistresses, and as an aside, their son, another John, would become the Bishop of Cambrai and father a few dozen bastards of his own. The Duke's closeness with Croy can be seen in the fact that he refers to Jean as his cousin on multiple occasions. Cousin was a relatively common appellation among the high nobility, who more often than not were literally cousins, but when used by a duke to refer to a lord, it does become a bit more notable. Jean de Croy also was rewarded with offices and privileges by John the Fearless. For example, he was made the governor of Artois and was granted the right to reside with the duke at all times. I think my first mention of Jean de Croy in this show was back when he led the decisive flanking maneuver that won John the Fearless the Battle of Outy. And I believe the second time that I mentioned him was a few years later, when he was captured by Charles of Orléans as the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War began to heat up. Now, unfortunately for the Lord of Croy, he would be held in prison for over a year, and even tortured while being interrogated about his involvement in the assassination of Louis of Orléans. Even if this year was a bad one for Croy, it does point to his importance. The suspicion that he was involved with the murder of Orléans came from the fact that he was a close confidant of John the Fearless, and most likely was indeed a part of the councils where the decision was made. When he was released, Croy was made the Grand Butler of France and Governor of Boulogne by the king, really the Duke of Burgundy, and given some other lands in compensation for his hardships. As the Civil War continued and the royal administration became ever more partisan, Croy was able to obtain even more through his master's dominance in France. But he wouldn't have too long to enjoy these gains, as he would die in 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt, along with one of his sons. So now it's time that we get to know the remaining Croy boys. Of Jean de Croy's surviving sons, the older was Antoine, and the younger was another Jean. And from here on out, when I say Jean de Croy without any qualifier, I'll be talking about the son rather than the father. Jean I de Croy was able to get his sons positions in Philip the Good's household, which proved to be a good move, as Antoine would form a close relationship with the future Duke of Burgundy, and their friendship would propel the family to new heights. Just as John the Fearless referred to Jean I as cousin, Philip the Good would do the same with Antoine and Jean II. That personal closeness netted the brothers significant political influence and material rewards. The Croys gained offices, pensions, lands, and power from the Duke as Philip showered the brothers with gifts and honors. For example, Antoine and Jean were both a part of the inaugural class of knights of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Both were also ducal counselors, and were among the counselors that most often took part in the deliberations of the ducal council. And remember, for much of this period, the council was literally just the most trusted advisors that the duke had around him at the time. So not only were the brothers influential, they were also often with the duke, especially Antoine, who served as Philippe's first chamberlain. When he fought alongside Philip the Good, Antoine would often carry the duke's banner in battle. But as the duke's trusted friend and officer, Antoine was also frequently deputized to deal with various rebellions and incursions, such as when Liège invaded Namur, against a neighboring petty lord or écuyer captain, or against Ghent in the early stages of their revolt. If Philip was going into battle without his first chamberlain at his side, it was usually because the Lord of Croy was dealing with whatever the second most important crisis at the time was. In addition to their close friendship with the Duke of Burgundy, the Croy were also tied into the regional noble networks. Jean I's mother, Isabella de Renty, came from one of the leading noble families in Artois, and his wife Marguerite de Craon came from one of the foremost in Picardy and Champagne. Antoine's first wife was the daughter of fellow Knight of the Golden Fleece, John of Roubaix. Jean II married Marie de la Lange, and their sister Jeanne married Jean de Lannoy. The Croy also began to expand their connections past the regional Burgundian nobility. Antoine de Croy's second wife, Margaret, was the daughter of Antoine de Vaudemont, and thus the scion of a ducal line. This match points to Croy's importance in the Burgundian court, not only because Margaret was a few steps up from him in the aristocratic hierarchy, but also because this marriage was made while Vaudemont was working to secure Burgundian support for his claim on the Duchy of Lorraine, and he evidently saw a marriage with the Croy as the best way to do it. The influence of the Croys would only continue to grow as Philip's reign went on. In 1434, Jean de Croy was named the Captain General and Bailiff of Hainaut, as well as the President of the Council of Hainaut. These appointments put him in charge of administration, justice, and the military of the county, a fairly unprecedented concentration of power in a given territory under Burgundian rule. In addition to his offices, Jean would also build influence in Hainaut through the acquisition of lands in the county, such as the lordship of Chimay, and the building of relationships with the local nobility, such as with his in-laws, the Lalangues. The next year, both brothers were deemed important enough to be bribed by Charles VII in order to facilitate the reconciliation at Arras. In the document that records these payments, they were referred to as being among Philip's, quote, leading confidential advisors in whom he places his trust. Antoine de Croy's standing with the Duke is also shown in the fact that he, along with Chancellor Nicolas Roland, was paid the largest sum. A few years later, Antoine was also named one of the primary governors of the Burgundian Netherlands in the absence of Philip the Good and Isabella of Portugal. In 1456, the Croy would bring another principality under their control when Antoine was made the governor of Luxembourg. This was in addition to him already being the governor of Namur and Boulogne, and his brother governing Hainaut. And that was just in terms of offices. The brothers had also built up a significant portfolio of personally owned lands over the years, both through ducal grants and their own purchases, and they had also acquired a large collection of jewels, plate, art, and other finery. It was this acquisitiveness that first pitted the Croy against the future Charles the Bold, as both Charles and Antoine laid claim to the movable possessions of Jeanne d'Harcourt, the Lady of Béthune. Charles had been granted the lordship of Béthune by his father, and he argued that this grant included Jeanne's movables as well. Antoine, on the other hand, had married Jeanne's niece, and he claimed the goods through inheritance. In any event, Antoine de Croy moved first and seized a large portion of Harcourt's possessions, much to Charles's irritation. At the very least, this is what Olivia de la Marche claims was the inciting incident of the, quote, hatred and suspicion which the Count of Charolais had for his father's favorites. However, there were some other factors involved as well. One of those factors was the fact that the Croy and Charolais fell on opposite sides of the England or France debate, and in fact the Croy were actually some of the most pro-French of all the Burgundian lords. As we just heard, the brothers were instrumental in the reconciliation at Arras, and they were handsomely rewarded for it. In addition to the bribes paid out by the king beforehand, Jean de Croy received additional payments worth 6,000 livres after the fact, and Antoine received the Castellany of Bar-sur-Aube in Champagne, and other grants, all told worth about 3,000 livres annually. We also see many occasions where the Croy were sent to the French court as Philippe's ambassadors, especially Jean. In fact, Jean de Croy would end up serving as Philip the Good's primary ambassador to France for many years, frequently traveling between the courts from the 1430s onwards. While Antoine de Croy wasn't engaged in negotiations quite as often as his brother was, the king did keep in touch with him, even sending him a letter where, even if he did not say it outright, he certainly implied that Antoine and his brother were working on his behalf to secure the return of the Somme towns, that vital strategic buffer between France and Burgundian Picardy. That being said, even if the Croy were working on it, I doubt that they were working on it that hard, as Charles VII was never able to regain the towns. But even if they were, they and the king faced an uphill battle. Even though French fortunes and finances had improved immensely over the years, the cost to redeem the towns was still too great for the king to afford. Therefore, he began to claim that the terms of the original grant had actually stated that the lease of the towns would end once Normandy had been reconquered. When this claim was brought to Philip, he dismissed it out of hand, and when it was suggested to the Duke that the Croys had implied that he would accept these terms, he immediately declared that, quote, I never once spoke of it to his Grace of Croy, nor to Sir Jean, and if they have presumed to speak of it, I disavow them, and they shall pay the price for it. For their part, the brothers vociferously denied that they had ever said anything of the like, much to the annoyance of Louis of Luxembourg, who was representing the king in these talks, and had claimed otherwise. And so the matter turned into a he said, she said, or I guess he said, considering that all of the ambassadors were men. In all honesty, it's difficult to determine exactly how far the Croy went in their pro-French sentiments at this point. If they really were trying to get the Duke to simply return the Somme towns for the heck of it, then it could easily be argued that they were pro-French to the point of betraying the Duke. If you ask me, that's going a bit far, and I could see them agreeing to maybe broach the subject with Philip to gauge a response, but not really anything past that. To me, it seems that the Croy were simply happy to accept gifts and grants of money and land from both king and duke, and thus it was in their best interests to maintain peace between France and Burgundy, so they never would have to choose where their loyalties ultimately lay. And while maybe a bit suspect, that can't really be argued to be inherently against Philip's interests, as he greatly desired peace as well. Additionally, while King Charles was keen to curry the support of the Croys, he could not be too overly concerned about it, as he did nothing to keep Jean de Croy from being excommunicated in 1455. This is actually an interesting case that I think warrants some getting into. The whole affair began when Jean, for reasons that I'm honestly not sure of, seized some goods from a cleric in Hainaut, Gilles Jalic. Jacqueline made an appeal to his alma mater, the University of Paris, which then summoned Jean to appear before a tribunal. Jean refused to appear at the university's tribunal, pointing that as Hainaut was in the Holy Roman Empire rather than France, the University of Paris didn't actually have any jurisdiction over his actions as bailiff. The university evidently disagreed with Jean's assessment, as they then excommunicated him for ignoring their summons. At this point, King Charles could have easily stepped in to protect Croy, but he declined to get involved. Instead, it was Philippe the Good who used his connections with the university to arrange for the excommunication to be lifted if Jean and Gilles could reach a settlement. However, Gilles refused to negotiate and instead posted the notice of excommunication on the doors of the Cathedral of Tournai, I'm sure with an element of glee, if I might read between the lines of Delamarche's memoirs here. The Duke of Burgundy then leveraged his good relationship with the Curia and appealed the case to the Pope, who arranged for a new tribunal to be held in imperial territory rather than in France. There, Jean de Croy reached an agreement with the University of Paris directly rather than Jacqueline, and had his sentence of excommunication lifted. While King Charles may not have been directly involved in this affair, he would not have disapproved of any attempt to push French influence into Burgundy, and Richard Vaughan includes this episode in the middle of a long list of other French encroachments and provocations. He also found this fun entry from the accounts of the Receiver General of Hainaut, where the clerk lets out some frustration against Gilles for triggering the situation by appealing to France in the first place. Quote, "Notwithstanding that he was born a subject of my lord the Duke, he has done him every conceivable harm and damage, on the pretext that he is a cleric studying in the University of Paris. Although the said land of Hainaut has never in any way been subject to, nor required to answer to, the said university, nor to the kingdom of France, this Sir Gilles has come forward like a fool, inspired by perverse and outrageous effrontery, to bring various citations into Hainaut." Jean de Croy may have retained some resentment towards French intervention in Hainaut after this point, and Hainaut, an imperial yet francophone and long French influence county, was often faced with subtle and not-so-subtle attempts by the crown to dominate it. For example, in 1457, royal officers arrested some Burgundian merchants in and around Hainaut, and in retaliation, Jean proposed that the Duke of Burgundy arrest French merchants in the county, a response that indicates that he cannot have been totally in King Charles's pocket, although Philip decided against this course of action. Still though, Jean de Croy would continue serving as an ambassador to France, and outside of Hainaut at least, would generally support French interests. One of the Croy's partners in this was Louis of Luxembourg, the Count of Saint-Pol, who we got to know 2 episodes back. As we saw then, Louis had begun his career as a stridently pro-English Burgundian lord, but after the death of his uncle, he had become just as stridently pro-French. Louis joined the French court, formed marriage ties with the houses of Anjou and Brittany, and rose through the ranks of the French army. As with the Croys, Luxembourg would often act as an ambassador between the courts, but while the Croy always served as Burgundian ambassadors to the French court, Louis of Luxembourg actually went both ways. But even though Luxembourg and the Croys were on the same side of the England or France debate at the Burgundian court, that did not necessarily mean that they were allies. And that became quite apparent when Antoine de Croy proposed a marriage between his son Philippe and Louis's daughter Jacqueline. Louis considered the match to be below his family's dignity. He came from a princely line after all, while the Croys, despite their current wealth and power, were still only a generation or 2 removed from being bannerets. Louis's sisters had married counts and dukes. Now his daughter was being asked to marry a mere lord. However, I'll note that Philippe de Croy's mother did come from a princely line herself, and by now Antoine de Croy was also a count, having purchased the County of Porcelain from Charles of Orléans a few years earlier. But these facts didn't seem to sway Saint-Pol, so maybe it's irrelevant. Louis refused the match, but Antoine de Croy would not take no for an answer, and decided to use his influence with Philip the Good to force the issue. In addition to railing against Luxembourg for refusing his proposal, Croy was sure to emphasize that the Count of Saint-Pol had not disdained a marriage alliance with the House of Anjou, who Philip the Good still viewed with a bit of suspicion, and in the course of this had handed over the County of Guise to Charles of Anjou as his sister's dowry. Now, Guise was not in Burgundian territory, so Louis didn't really need Philip's permission to hand it over, but the county did directly border Burgundian Picardy, and Louis was a Burgundian vassal for many of his other territories, so the Duke could argue that he actually should have some say, or at the very least was an interested party. This was not the only way that Antoine de Croy worked to turn the Duke against Saint-Pol, although the chronicles are fairly vague. For example, Escouchi simply states, quote, "And notwithstanding this, the Lord of Croy would try every day to persuade the Duke his master to remove the Count from his presence." Well, vague as it might be, this urging worked, and Louis of Luxembourg was soon on the outs with Philip. And he saw that if he were to regain favor with the Duke, he would have to accept the marriage. Antoine de Croy was not content with a simple yes. He also had it written into the marriage contract that if the marriage was to be broken off, Louis would have to pay him a large sum in restitution, and forced Saint-Pol to send Jacqueline into his household to be brought up there until she was old enough for the marriage to take place. Louis did not seem to warm to the prospect of the Croys being his in-laws over the years, and still wanted to make a more prestigious match for his daughter. In 1455, Jacqueline and Philippe were deemed old enough to wed, and as Escouchi writes, quote, "The said Lord of Croy, knowing full well that the said Count of Saint-Pol and his other children were by no means pleased with the terms of the marriage, decided to set a date for their wedding. And he sent word to the said Count of Saint-Pol and his other children, stating that if it pleased them to be there, he would be most delighted." Well, Saint-Pol was less than delighted, and attempted to break off the marriage. He tried to demand his daughter back, and offered to pay the restitution. But the Lord of Croy would not accept. He was determined to go ahead with the ceremony. Louis of Luxembourg refused to attend, and instead sent his son, John of Luxembourg, to Luxembourg, confusingly enough, where Croy was the governor and where the marriage was set to take place. John headed out with a company of soldiers to try and abduct/rescue Jacqueline, but Antoine de Croy was tipped off about this plan. He sent riders out to intercept John and tell him that, quote, if he had come to Luxembourg to attend his sister's wedding, he was most welcome. But if he had come for any other purpose, he would not be allowed to enter the city. John had been relying on the element of surprise and did not have the means to force entry into the town of Luxembourg, and so he retreated and the marriage went ahead. Croy made sure that it was then consummated so that Saint-Pol would not be able to have it annulled, and to add insult to injury, along with the news of the marriage and consummation, came a request for Saint-Pol to kindly hand over his daughter's dowry, which Louis of Luxembourg unsurprisingly refused to do. The relationship between the now in-laws only continued to deteriorate after the marriage took place. Croy renewed his efforts to turn Philip the Good against the Count of Saint-Pol, and the next year Philip seized Louis's lordship of Enghien in Hainaut. Interestingly enough, this was the only territory in the Holy Roman Empire which Louis held from Philip, and the Duke of Burgundy left Louis's French fiefs alone, likely figuring that the Count of Saint-Pol might appeal his case to the King of France, who would be only too happy to take an opportunity to flex his royal prerogative. When Louis came to hear the charges which had caused the seizure, No mention of Croy was made, but rather the Duke railed against the Count of Saint-Pol for being ungrateful for all that Burgundy had done for him and his family, and then accused him of a variety of crimes. From what I can tell, Louis didn't exactly deny the charges of the crimes so much as try to explain and excuse them. He did, however, argue that he had been a good vassal to the Duke, and added that, quote, he knew for certain that at this court there were some who inflamed the Duke against him and did not love him. Wonder who that could be. In any event, Louis's explanations were not deemed satisfactory, and Philippe would retain Enghien, at least for the time being. But while Louis of Luxembourg was not happy to make a match with the Croys, many other families were. Jean II's son, another Philippe, married a daughter of the Count of Moors. One of Antoine's daughters, Jeanne, married the Count Palatine of Zweibrücken, while another, Marie, married the Count of Blankenheim, and after his death, the Count of Werneberg. These marriage alliances both illustrate the rising status of the Croys, and how an alliance with the family could be considered valuable to independent rulers who were still within Burgundy's orbit. Moors, Zweibrücken, Blankenheim, and Werneberg were all imperial counties neighboring or near Philip the Good's lands, and if these counts couldn't form an alliance directly with the House of Burgundy, the Croys were considered to be the next best thing. In addition to their influence with the Duke of Burgundy, the Croys had also become powerful lords and valuable allies in their own right. For instance, on one occasion, Antoine de Croy was able to send 4,000 Picardy soldiers to the Count of Zweibrücken to help him out in a war against his cousin. The power of the Croy can really be seen in Hainaut, where Jean II had built up quite the patrimony for himself. In addition to his offices, Jean had acquired the major lordships of Chimay, which would eventually be raised to a county, and Quievron, as well as a large number of other lordships, properties, seigneurial rights, privileges, and dues that I won't enumerate because I actually think that it would take minutes to go through them all. Antoine had a foothold in the county himself, and Georges Chastelain writes that the brothers, quote, held all the fortresses and strongholds along the county's borders. And when he was ready to retire after spending over 20 years as the Grand Bailiff and Captain General of Hainaut, Jean arranged for his son Philippe to succeed him. The vast power, wealth, and influence of the Croy began to weigh heavily on some at the Burgundian court. Most were content to make nice with them and enter their network of patronage and alliances, but others would try and defy them, and that did not tend to go too well. We just saw that Louis of Luxembourg lost Enghien after he tried to break off a marriage with Antoine de Croy, and in 1457, Charles, Count of Charolais, would find that when asked to choose between him and the Croy, his father would choose the Croy. This dispute began with an open position in the Count of Charolais' household. Antoine de Croy knew that Charles might still be nursing some ill will from the dispute about the Harcourt inheritance the previous year, and so figured that giving his nephew a foot in the door might help to repair the relationship. This was Jean's son, Philippe de Croy, the Lord of Sempy, by the way, not to be confused with Antoine's own son, Philippe de Croy, the Lord of Renty. Even though Charles had grown to distrust the Croy, he had had a pretty good relationship with Sempy in the past. That Philippe de Croy had already served in Charolais' household for a little while, and was a childhood friend of the Count, according to Olivia de la Marche. However, Charles had his own man in mind for the job, Antoine Roland, the son of Philip's chancellor, Nicolas Roland, and he did not appreciate the Croys interfering with the composition of his household. The Count refused to appoint the Lord of Sempy, and so the Croy got to work. Georges Chastelain writes that they hoped that Philip could persuade his son, quote, who, though they had done him no wrong, wanted to bring them low, as it seemed to them, in order to advance the bloodline of the Chancellor, which was not a just thing, they said, nor should it be tolerated by the Duke, because he was the father and guardian of the nobility, and therefore bound to uphold their honor. We can thus see that this dispute was not only between the Croy and Charolais, but also between the Croy and Chancellor Roland. Nicolas Roland was the second or third most powerful man in Burgundy, depending on how you rank him and Antoine de Croy, and the two did not always see eye to eye. Sides were forming, and the Croy were gathering allies. Some at court thought that the Chancellor wielded too much power and had made too much money through his Burgundian service, even if the Croy had gained far more. These were joined by others with personal grudges against the Chancellor, such as Thibaut de Neuchâtel, the Marshal of Burgundy, whose cousin Roland had executed for plotting against the Duke. In any event, this dispute would begin to turn the Duke against his Chancellor, who he now thought to be wielding undue influence over his son. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I will also add that I find the comment about advancing the bloodline of the Chancellor a tad ironic, because while he did come from bourgeois origins, he had since been ennobled, and Antoine Roland's mother came from a noble family herself. This argument is thus basically the same one that Louis of Luxembourg used to object to the marriage between his daughter and Philippe de Croy, the Lord of Renty. On January the 17th, 1457, while the court was in Brussels, Philip called Charles of Charolais and Isabella of Portugal into his private chapel after hearing Mass. There, he demanded that the Count of Charolais appoint the Lord of Sempy to his household. Charles pointed out that when he had initially appointed Antoine Roland, his father had not objected, and he had brought his household ordinances with him, which reflected that. Philip responded, "Do not concern yourself with the ordinances, for it is up to me to add or subtract to them, and it is my will that the Lord of Sempy be placed there." Charles begged his father to let him keep his initial appointment of Roland, which again his father had allowed, and added, "I see it clearly, it was the Lord of Croy who put this idea in your head." Philip was a proud and passionate man, and his temper was beginning to run away from him. The Duke now only saw his son as defiant, refusing to obey him, the master of the family, household, and land. After some more back and forth, Philip was starting to see red. The Duke's face turned pale, and a look of rage flashed over his face. He grabbed the ordinances and flung them into the fire, screaming, "Boy, you dare disobey my will! Get out of my sight!" Now Isabella, fearful for her son's safety, stepped in. The Duchess pushed the Count of Charolais out of the chapel and fled with him. Not quite knowing where to go, Isabella led Charles to Dauphin Louis's quarters, and begged the French prince to intercede with Philip. At this point, Louis had only been in Burgundy for a few months, and still did not quite know where he stood with everyone. What's more, he had come to Burgundy because of a dispute with his own father. Might Philip now blame him for Charolais' defiance? Still, the Dauphin had been trying to build a friendship with the Count of Charolais, and this seemed like a good opportunity to reinforce that. Despite his misgivings, the Dauphin agreed to talk to the Duke of Burgundy. But Philip was still seeing red. He replied to the Dauphin's intercession without the obsequious servility that he had shown upon Louis's arrival. Quote, "Enough! Forgive me, my lord, but I beg you not to make such a request. I am not ready to forgive Charles, and I will show him that I am his father, and that I can appoint a valet if I please." Louis continued to plead, and Philip changed his approach, if not the core of his response. Quote, "My lord, I would not refuse anything to you, and I am bound by your prayers and demands. If the matter of Charles is so close to your heart that you wish for me to forgive him, I am willing to do so, and you may watch over him and provide for him. But from then on, you will never see me again. Let your will be done, but mine shall remain as it is." The Dauphin was at the mercy of his host, and he knew that pushing any further could endanger his own position. Would 2 disobedient sons be enough for Duke and King to see eye to eye? Would Philip send Louis back to the French court? The Dauphin was not keen to find out. He took his leave from the Duke, walking as fast as he could to be away from Philip's wrath as soon as possible. Louis returned to his chambers to give Charles and Isabella the bad news. The Duchess despaired and returned to her own chambers, while Charles figured that he better make himself scarce and decided to get out of town. Philip, for his part, was still in a bit of a frenzy. He sent word to the Croy to meet him in the town of Hull, and then he headed out alone, without telling anyone at court where he was going. The journey from Brussels to Hull was not a long one, but it was already getting late. It was raining, and the ground was wet both from the rain and from a recent thaw. Georges Chastelain writes, quote, "Nevertheless, the Duke, paying heed to neither the rain nor the storm, and wishing to exercise his vigor, set out, criss-crossing the fields here and there as he pleased. In order to break up his path and avoid being followed, he went back and forth, now through mountains, now through valleys, wandering so far that hardly anyone could have followed him. He did this in the belief that he would always be able to find his way back to the road towards Hull. But he was mistaken, for it would have been very difficult, even in broad daylight, for a man well acquainted with the country." Night fell, and the Duke realized that he was lost, as he found himself riding through a forest. He had had nothing to eat or drink for hours, and was not dressed for the weather or for travel more generally. The branches poked at him and tore his clothes. The paths came and went. The ground was uneven and muddy. His horse fell more than a few times, breaking his saddle at one point and injuring his leg. Finally, after hours of riding, walking, and despairing, he stumbled upon a charcoal burner's cottage in the woods. After some time knocking on the door to wake the charcoal burner, and then convincing him that he was not about to rob him, the Duke was let in, given food and drink, and warmed himself by the fire. After eating and resting, the Duke found out that he was less than a league from the nearest town, and with the charcoal burner to guide him, he made it safely there a few hours later, and was able to recover in the house of one of his huntsmen who happened to live there. Philip gave the charcoal burner a gold florin for his troubles, a pittance for the Duke, but worth well more than everything else the man owned put together. While Philip was off on his adventure, or if you prefer, hissy fit, his court was going mad with worry. The Duke had disappeared, and no one knew where he had gone. Duchess Isabella and her daughter-in-law, Countess Isabella, were both in states of panic. The Countess of Charolais' condition was made worse by the fact that she was 8 months pregnant, and now worried that her father-in-law might do something rash, like disinherit her husband. Dauphin Louis gathered some of his attendants and began searching the city and countryside for the Duke. But Philip's attempts to go unnoticed had succeeded. No one could give the Dauphin a direction, and no tracks could be found. For their part, the Croy were equally worried when Philip did not show up to their rendezvous, even more so when a message from the Dauphin arrived, stating that the Duke had disappeared from court without a trace. However, before too long, the charcoal burner who had been sent ahead reached Hull with news of the Duke's state and whereabouts. Antoine rode out to meet Philip, and then together they made for the castle of Genappe, so that the Duke could make himself presentable before more people began to arrive inquiring of him. This all began on Monday, and Philip and Antoine finally reached Genappe Tuesday evening. By then, word had reached Brussels that the Duke was safe. That news was well received, but the court, including Duchess Isabella, Countess Isabella, and Dauphin Louis, were still unsure of Philip's attitude towards them and Charles at this point. So, Wednesday morning, the Dauphin sent Philippe Pot, a knight in the Duke's household known for his quick thinking and affability, to check in on Philip the Good. Pot saw the Duke's wound being tended to, and greeted his lord with an allusion to the chivalric romances that the court was so obsessed with. "Good day, my lord, good day. What is all this? Are you playing King Arthur now, or Sir Lancelot? Did you think that there were not enough Sir Tristans wandering the ways? As I can see, you have not been without adventures." Disarmed and now laughing, Philip recounted his adventures as if he had lived through one of those chivalric romances. He then agreed to return to Brussels after a few days of recovering, and he agreed to forgive his son, provided that the Count of Charolais submit to his will regarding the household and dismiss certain officers that the Duke considered to be a bad influence. Still, Philip's displeasure with his son did not abate entirely, and could still be seen in the Duke's response to Antoine de Croy when he indicated his worry about his standing with Charles, quote, "Let my son trouble you no more than he does me. I am his father and shall be his master, and I never intend to abandon my servants to his whims. With what is mine and mine alone, I shall do as I please, and I am not to be placed under the guardianship of a child." It took the personal entreaties of Countess Isabella to really soften the Duke's heart. Charles returned to court and was formally reconciled with his father, but a growing distance between the two remained. Charles would stay at the Burgundian court for the next few months, but after that would begin to spend more and more time away. The Count of Charolais spent the next several years bouncing between different castles and cities in the Burgundian Netherlands, especially in Holland and Zeeland, and would only return to his father's court a few times a year. While a bit of distance did seem to calm the relationship between father and son, it did nothing for Charolais and the Croy. Charles blamed them for the whole incident, and his disdain for his father's favorites only grew from here on out. Philip also began to grow distant from Isabella of Portugal in the wake of this episode. Olivia de la Marche relates that, quote, "The Duke complained about his wife, the Duchess, who had abandoned him to follow her son." And, like her son, Isabella was also growing frustrated with the dominance of the Croy and the pro-French faction at court. Her advice was being increasingly ignored, and her allies were losing ground. Philip even refused to speak to her for a while, as he blamed her for Charles's defiance. The Duchess would withdraw from court soon after, and would remain distant for some time, turning to a simpler life of religious contemplation. The Duke's family were not the only ones being pushed out of the way by the Croy. Nicolas Roland's influence with Philip had already begun to decline, and now the Croys and the Chancellor's other enemies whispered that Roland wished to influence the son and use him to rule over the father. That this might touch a nerve for Philip can be seen in his repeated declarations that he would show the Count of Charolais that he was his father, and ruled both his lands and his family. Roland's enemies now had momentum on their side. They convinced the Duke to open an inquiry about the Chancellor's perceived corruption. He was a rich man after all, but that did not seem to find any damning evidence. They then latched onto complaints about the conduct and overreach of one son, the Cardinal Bishop of Autun, and had another, Guillaume, accused of murder. Guillaume did not help his case by fleeing the Duke's lands. He argued that he could not expect a fair trial while his father's enemies were ascendant, but it certainly did make him look guilty. The combination of all of this was enough to finally drive Roland out of favor. He was not fully disgraced, nor was he even removed from the office of Chancellor, but he was no longer trusted implicitly as he once was, and he had lost his position as the second or third most powerful man in Burgundy. He began to be excluded from the Duke's close councils, and his ability to direct the Burgundian administration was gone. Also around this time, Jean Chevreul, the Bishop of Tournai and president of Philip's ducal council, retired. Chevreul was an ally of Roland, but his departure had more to do with age and infirmity than anything else. Still though, this retirement marked the continued advance of the Croy, as Chevreul's replacement, Guillaume Philastre, was a close ally of the brothers. As the 1450s closed, the Duke found himself ever more enthralled. His wife and son were keeping their distance, his loyal chancellor withdrew from the administration, and the head of his council had just retired. There was no one left with enough influence to even attempt to stand up to the Croy. The Picard clan, always powerful, now began a period of unrivaled dominance at the Burgundian court. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours; Mario, Duc de Tonnerre; Bartosz, Duc de Beaurevoir; Connor, Duc de Clairon; Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein; Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois; Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau; Mark, Comte de Meursault; Diana, Graf von Beersel; Mehmet, Comte Santerre; Chris, Comte de Semur; Rosa, Comte de Germol; Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand; Eric, Comte de Couche; Jonathan, Comte de Bezoche; Olivier, Comte d'Ussert; Craig, Graf von Hunsbrook; Bennett, Comte de Courcelles; David, Comte de Auricourt; James, Graf von Dussen; Vincent, Graf von Hernen; and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on X or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com, and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.